Welcome, everybody, to this final festive update from the EEC for 2020. I'm Luke Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council. This week, I'm joined by two of my colleagues. Rob Murray-Leach, Head of Policy at the Energy Efficiency Council, is, of course, with us. Welcome, Rob.
Hello.
And Holly Taylor, Senior Manager for Projects and Partnership at the Energy Efficiency Council. And Holly, you're resplendent in those reindeer antlers. Thank you for once again making an effort for today's video.
I think we've learnt that I like making an effort for videos, so found another headpiece that I thought might suit the occasion.
Nothing if not game. That's what we say about Holly. So to say 2020 has had its fair share of challenges is a massive understatement, but there have also been some big highlights, swings and roundabouts for the agenda that we work hard on behalf of our members to prosecute day in and day out. So we thought we'd take the opportunity, rather than writing another big policy update, which probably everybody's over at this point, with all due respect to you, Rob, of actually just getting together, having a chat and reflecting out loud about what some of the challenges and highlights have been for the Energy Efficiency Council and for the broader sector and for the entire network here in Australia that really is so passionate about energy efficiency. So I thought I might start with you, Rob. I know you've drawn yourself a little bit of a diagram there of all the ins and outs of energy efficiency. Yep. There you go. So maybe don't take us through the full wonder of your mind map, but can you give us some of the highlights?
No, look, it looks like the London Underground took acid. I wouldn't want to go through that really complicated route. But roughly, what the story really for policy this year, I think it starts with there's a quote from Woody Allen film, which is, "If you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans." And that was pretty much 2020. So there was a lot on the agenda from the end of 2020, 2019, a lot of things which were really ramping up at the beginning of the years, and obviously COVID through a spanner in a lot of people's works and it affected really everything, every aspect of many people's businesses, your ability on an obvious sense of being able to get to a site. A lot of energy users became very wary about spending capital. We worked a lot with members to understand the impacts of COVID, and when we saw it was kind of interesting. So you had that as the negative, but on the other side, so a lot of energy users really keen to find any savings that they could, but also a real elevated interest in energy management, because if you're running a commercial building and you have to shut it down, suddenly you have to understand the mechanics of your building in a way you never had to before. And from a household perspective, you had people stuck in their homes all winter. It was cold, it was miserable, and their energy bills went through the roof. So what we saw was really different impacts between those sectors. So the business sector, capital constraint was king and really impeded investment. For households, what we saw was, yes, income was down, but because people had less spending on eating out, they reallocated a lot of that expenditure to upgrading their homes. And particularly the thermal comfort of their homes. I think people really realized finally, particularly in Melbourne, how miserably cold their homes were during this winter. If you're spending 24 hours a day in your home, you realize how bad it is. So we did see a real increase in interest and expenditure on household efficiency. But what we saw, and this is the same picture around the world, it really depended what governments chose to do on policy. And I know, Luke, I mean, you and I have talked about this quite a few times. It could have gone very bad. There were some very bad things that happened quite quickly. So WA, for example, WA government decided to not progress with the implementation of the National Construction Code 2019 update at all, which from a fire perspective, let alone energy efficiency, I think is kind of bonkers, but that's their choice. And we saw some other sensible decisions. Victoria, for example, decided to delay some of their decisions around the Victorian upgrades, and the CBD program that rates the energy efficiency of offices decided to put on ice the plans to expand to hotel sector, which kind of made a lot of sense. But some of those delays were actually quite short term. So Victoria ended up just last week announcing the targets for VEU, and they were exactly the same ones that were recommended at the end of 2019, and in fact some fairly sensible changes to the proposal they made then. And then as a real upside to that, there was a hell of a lot of investment of stimulus. Now, we'll talk about this probably a bit later, but that decision by governments wasn't in a vacuum. There was a lot of work by EEC members, yourself, and a lot of our partners to make that happen. But just to kind of recap, I mean, we're probably thinking it's hard to estimate. There's some clear financial things such as 190 million roughly investment in government efficiency, so upgrading the efficiency of government buildings. There was huge stimulus in Victoria for the household sector, particularly lower income households, in upgrading social housing, new social housing, and upgrading sort of, I think it was 250,000 heating systems in lower income households. So really big stuff. But then it's much harder to quantify the impacts of some other policies that were announced, like minimum rental standards in ACT and Victoria, that I think will have huge implications for the household sector. So, you know, in total, it's probably something in the region of about $2 billion worth of investment driven energy efficiency through government policy. So I think it's been a very tough year for the sector, but we shouldn't underestimate just how well we've actually come through it in terms of the sector's really probably in the best position it could be with some of the announcements coming out of government than we could have hoped, really.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, the resilience of this space on a whole range of fronts, and you've picked up on a couple of them there, Rob. You've obviously got businesses continuing to engage. You know, obviously capital investments are a little bit trickier depending on which part of the economy you're in, but investment hasn't ground to a halt. There are still members doing work out in the market, which is incredibly heartening. And as you say, we've seen governments around the country, particularly at the state level, demonstrating that they're able to manage a very profound health crisis, but also think at the same time about how they restart the economy and take the advice from some of those bodies like the IEA and the IMF, who very early on, to their great credit, were really proactively advising governments about where they were going to get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of stimulus spending. And you've seen this almost in terms of you and I are advocates in this space, and there was almost this pensive movement of, you know, this incredible international conversation that was taking place around saying energy efficiency is absolutely at the top of the list in terms of stimulus priorities, because of the triple and quadruple dividends you get out of it in terms of carbon and health and comfort and bill savings and the like. And then at the same time here in Australia, there was this incredible moment of advocates and stakeholders from across the political spectrum, and business groups and unions and environment groups and organisations like ours, coming together around energy efficiency, and that big statement in May saying, well, you know, of all the things that governments could do right now, energy efficiency is the one thing that we can all agree on. Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of, you know, some of these big things would not have happened without COVID. I think it's fair to say with the Victorian government, half the people in the Victorian government are pretty surprised how big the government went in terms of stimulus, right? But not just in energy efficiency, across the board. But the thing is, this is built on a real sea change. You get these changes and they're sort of very subtle. They're beneath the surface. It's like kind of Loch Ness Monster. It's only when the head comes up that you kind of realize that there's this big body that's been building for years. And I really think that a lot of people have been putting in a lot of work and changing their thinking. We've certainly changed a lot of our thinking about the role of energy efficiency in the economy. So there's people from the health space, from the welfare space, from business advocacy sectors, from the manufacturing sector, who've really realized this is in their interests. And I think that's sort of, it started to coalesce pretty heavily last year, to be honest. You know, I know that Holly's probably going to be talking about some of the partnerships we've got with our NGO partners, but that sort of really sort of coalesced prior to COVID. But then this sort of turbocharged it and gave a platform for people to get onto. So I actually think, and you can see this in the energy market, the debate until recently has been very renewables dominated. And really in the last year, it's moved to like, okay, well, yeah, we actually need to manage the way we use energy. Normally it's the other way around. Like normally energy efficiency is the main course and renewables is the fancy dessert you have at the end. But, you know, Australia's a policy toddler. So we started with the sweet stuff first, all the renewables. And then people realize, no, I actually need to have some balanced nutrition and get the energy management part of it sorted out. And I think that debate's really shifted, like fundamentally shifted. So I think it's not just we're doing well this year. I think we've actually set ourselves up as a sector to deliver a major components of the energy transition and the health transition in the next 5-10 years.
Well, it's the overnight success that's, well over a decade in the making, right? We've, and not just us, but obviously a whole range of our partners have been working incredibly hard to build that case over time. And one of the things about stimulus spending is that you need to make decisions quickly. And so you don't have time to go and, conduct a 6 or 12-month study to work out what to do. It's based on the evidence that's available at the time. It's often based on programs that you've got some experience with, or other jurisdictions have experience with, that you can quickly rip off and get out into the market, because it's imperative that the money hits the economy ASAP. And so without all of that work, the idea's in the back pocket, as it were. We wouldn't have had the outcomes that we've had over the last 6 months. And I really want to pay tribute to the network. I don't want it to sound like, the Energy Efficiency Council is taking all the credit for all these incredible outcomes. And I know that's not what you're saying, Rob. What is incredibly notable about this year is the diversity of individuals and organisations that have backed in this agenda, and the message that governments have been hearing has been incredibly consistent, which makes it a lot easier to get across the line when you've also got the evidence base and sophisticated departments and public servants putting up sensible budget bids. All of those things need to come together, and they've coalesced in a really exciting way this year. So, Holly, I might turn to you. You're, I understand, going to reflect on that broad agenda from the perspective of projects and partnerships, and some of the things that have been achieved at the EEC and by the broader sector in that space.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I think it's really clear for me, if I could sum up 2020 in one word for the Energy Efficiency Council, it's partnerships. That by no means means that we weren't working with our partners beforehand. And as Rob pointed out, we were getting some really good places, but, we put in a concerted effort at the start of the year, pre-COVID, to go, we really want to be working more closely with our partners. And that kicked off the year with us setting up our NGO partnership program, which is effectively formal relationships with a lot of the industry associations and advocacy bodies that we were already working with, to just formalize that and strengthen those partnerships. And I'm really happy we did that, because then as we went into effectively our push for an efficient recovery in the first half of the year, it meant that we already had a lot of really strong advocates, and we already had really good relationships, not just with the policy wonks in those organisations, but with their comms teams as well. And that's really strengthened the messaging around what's happening in the country, and really culminated really well in the efficient recovery event that we had on the 1st of July with Michael Liebrich. Like, if you think about what that was and the amount of organisations that signed up and said, this is what we want, and then if you think about the outcomes that you've just discussed, it's really quite impactful to see that growth in how we're working together. And as Rob said, really starting to see that sea change in what's happening in policy spaces. But that is not where it ended for partnerships this year. Indeed, Rob's been working really closely with ASBEC in the second half of the year, and a number of other industry associations and consumer advocates around insulation. We've been working really closely with the International Energy Agency's Energy in Buildings and Communities program, really just working with other people to leverage their knowledge and amplify smart voices. And like, one of the biggest things that I'm really excited for as the year comes to a close is the fact that the Race for 2030 CRC is starting to contract projects. Now, this is really exciting as we look forward to the next decade of what's happening in Australia, and the debate really does move from being all supply side focused, renewables, to how do we make this energy system work so that it's affordable and it's reliable and it's sustainable. And, the three of us know all too well that demand and supply need to be at an equal footing, but it's a really great time in terms of what's happening in the debate in Australia, in that that's starting to become mainstream knowledge. And indeed, we've got a huge CRC, the biggest ever, with a multitude of industry and research partners really getting behind that idea. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with all of our NGO partners, our wider stakeholder groups, and indeed the Race for 2030 to work on improving the amazing things we've actually achieved this year. So, I mean, as a person that's relatively new to the energy efficiency industry in Australia, it's really great to see the sheer growth that we've had in the past few years, and especially this year. Like, to me, it's a watershed moment where we're really going to start to get really progressive policy that puts the demand side on an equal footing with the supply side, delivering favourable outcomes for consumers.
And I suppose that's where, the agenda that Rob's been talking about on the policy side sort of intersects with the work that you've been so ably prosecuting this year, Holly, around projects, which is a lot of that work is about creating the evidence base so we can take that insight that we need the demand side to step up, and we need the demand side to play a very active role in the broader energy transition, and actually start to tease apart some of those knotty problems about how we actually realise that vision, from a technology perspective, but importantly from a policy and regulatory perspective as well in Australia. And there's that virtuous circle, right? If we can, work with our partners, including Race, but also many others. I know the insulation project you referenced that, Rob, obviously you've been personally championing with the New South Wales government, the Victorian government, and ICANZ and Insulation Australasia, those two insulation bodies and those two big state governments coming together in good faith to say, well, how do we make sure that insulation is playing the role we know it needs to play in the energy transition in terms of the health, comfort, taking care of vulnerable Australians, and making sure that we get to live in homes that are warm in winter and cool in summer, and that's not regarded as some special privilege. That's incredibly important work, and that network piece, working with our partners, is something which has been a huge part of the EEC going right back to when you founded it. Now, I know, Rob, back in 2009. I think what's different in the last 2 or 3 years is we really codified it. It's kind of really embedded. We've got processes around it. We've got people like you, Holly, that are actually keeping Rob and I honest and making sure that we're connecting with our partners and not getting distracted and going off on frolics of our own, but actually, really, really doing what we say in our current strategy, which is expanding and activating the network, so powerful both on the projects and the policy side.
I'd probably add that it's really clear this year that by codifying it, it's proving that we are stronger together. Correct me if I'm wrong, gents, but this is probably your biggest bonanza year in terms of energy efficiency programs that have been announced by government. This is a really significant year in terms of what we're getting and what it means, particularly for Victorians, but there are programs across the country, and it really is a game changer in terms of what it means for us as those of us living in houses. And yes, a lot of those programs are targeted at low-income households, but as we all know, if there's programs in low-income households, it's going to drop the costs generally, which means middle-class Australians are far more likely to then do the upgrades, because they're going to see other people realizing the health and comfort and financial benefits and go, I want that too. Oh, look, it's way cheaper. So it's the exact same, market transformation model that's seen so many middle-class Australians put solar PV on their roofs. And, that's really exciting to see that our government, as we as Victorians, are really putting their might behind it and leading that transition. And it's really exciting.
So, look, I might chip in with some highlights for me. I kind of want to pay tribute to some of our political leaders for some big calls that have been made this year. And we've talked at a high level around stimulus, and obviously the first cab off the rank has to be the Victorian Minister for Energy and Environment and Climate Change, Lily D'Ambrosio, who was able to announce that incredible $1 billion package of measures, with that sort of 800 million odd package of residential energy efficiency upgrades at its very heart. Just smart stimulus, smart policy, because it's starting to support electrification and improve thermal performance in the homes of the most vulnerable Victorians, which are most in danger of getting left behind as we move through this energy transition. Really forward thinking policy.
The thing I'm most impressed about is she managed to move the budget, convince the Premier to move the budget to the same day as our conference so that she could announce them at the conference. That is a hard political task. So congratulations, Lily. Thank you.
Well, we certainly did appreciate that, Rob. That was a great way to kick off the National Energy Efficiency Conference 2020. And look, some of her colleagues around the country have done really incredible stuff as well. We shouldn't forget the incredible work being done in South Australia on a whole bunch of fronts, but particularly the 60 million committed over 2 years to public building upgrades. by Minister Van Holst Pelikan. A very significant per capita investment from South Australia in public building upgrades, and we know that's incredibly smart stimulus because government can just get on with it. Obviously, the ACT is doing incredible work in terms of blazing a trail on all kinds of fronts, and have really taken the ball by the horns when it comes to the next tranche of demand side improvements with minimum rental standards, which were also announced in Victoria, but also ramping up their ambition across a whole range of different policies, including again public building upgrades. Shout out to Minister Keane. Minister Keane, just observing his progress with great interest, just in terms of how he's prosecuting the case around energy and climate from the conservative side of politics, and really leading with his chin, and I think showing that there's a different way of engaging with that debate. And you can see a sensible centre, Rob, being carved out in the energy and climate space at that state level.
Oh, look, absolutely. And I think the great thing for me about that is climate and energy shouldn't be political. Like, they're fairly sensible places. And once you start to have a lot more consensus around some of those key aims, we can have much more nuanced conversations about what we do. So the downside for me of when there's some contest around ideas that seem like they're politicized, you don't have the contest in the details, and the contest in the details are what really makes the difference between a highly effective transformation of our buildings, our industry, and our energy system to something that's sort of, big slabs of money versus opposition to any action is never a helpful space for anyone. So I think really that leadership across the aisle on these issues has been extraordinary to see in the last couple of years.
And look, at the federal level, I think we should note the significant investment in the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the expansion of remit. Now, that's the kind of thing that it almost would have been understandable if it had gone by the wayside in this of all years, with all the things that particularly the federal government has been needing to deal with. But that didn't happen. We got a significant additional commitment. We got that expansion of remit finally, formally bringing the demand side into the tent when it comes to energy innovation. And people of goodwill will quibble about sort of inclusions in and out of the remit and sort of what technology should be at the top of the list. But it really gives us a basis on which to engage with ARENA as a body in the next decade, in which we simply didn't have over the last decade, and ensures that it's going to remain an important institution in Australia's energy transition. I might just throw to both of you to say if there's any final thoughts before we wrap up this brief reflection on 2020.
I'd probably jump in and say I really enjoyed Rob's analogy earlier about a balanced diet. Like, the reality is we now do have all governments at the state and federal level really viewing renewables and demand side solutions on an equal footing, and that balanced diet is really important for the health of Australia, not just Australia's energy system, but for the growth of our economy and for our living standards at home. And I'm really excited to see that we are getting great progress from all levels of government. And indeed, I'd be remiss to mention that local councils are also leading the way. You're seeing huge announcements from a lot of the larger councils around the country. You're seeing quite substantial commitments to net zero from regional councils as well. And you're seeing really great works from the likes of Cities Power Partnership, which is basically working really closely with councils to support them on that energy transition, and to really help them with not just setting up a PPA, but also putting in energy efficiency in their local council operations, and also supporting local businesses with opportunities around cutting costs as well through energy performance upgrades. So really do appreciate the fact that this year we've seen government leadership at all levels, and that's what we want to see moving forward.
Final thoughts, Rob?
Look, I think the best thing for me this year has been, look, the downside, obviously, of being locked in your house is you don't get to see a lot of your friends and your family. The bright side is that I had much, much more time to catch up with people that we work with, and around the country and around the world. And that's actually genuinely been really exciting. And we can talk about, partnerships and it's sort of oh, there's a danger of it sounding kind of corporatized and like, oh, we love our partners and blah, blah, blah. But in all honesty, it's like talking about energy efficiency without the people we work with doesn't make any sense, right? You can talk about energy efficiency in buildings without the buildings is actually nothing. And in industry doesn't mean anything. And, it's like the recognition for the incredible work that Kelly Court at ACOS has done in the last few years, really bringing together the household space and the welfare sector to really see those benefits for its members. I think it's been incredible. So it's been just great to learn off so many people. I mean, the thrilling bit for me about the installation program is to work with so many people who genuinely know what they're talking about and bringing that knowledge together and bringing those people together, many of whom didn't already know each other. So I think, it's been fantastic to work with so many smart people to learn off them. And I'm hopefully doing a lot more of that next year.
Yeah, here, and I completely agree. I finish 2020 with a stronger sense of the energy efficiency community here in Australia and around the world, and a sense of connection. And some of that's been driven by projects and the need to engage on issues that we're grappling with here in Australia. Some of it's been driven by new things that we've tested and really embraced, like the weekly podcast, which has been an opportunity to catch up with what's happening around the world, which we could have done at any time, but this year it became an imperative to stay connected, stay plugged in, and to also share new thinking and fresh thinking with our audience here in Australia. So there's been some real gifts of 2020. There's been some challenges, but there's been some really lovely things that have emerged as well.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing will be working out as we go forward which one of those ones we want to keep and which things we discard. So Friday night cocktails with your friends because you can't catch up within a bar, in the bin, right? But I'm going to be quite honest about that. Zoom conference cocktails, no. But podcasts and it's really interesting thinking through which events we want to keep in person so we can actually catch up with people and have those sort of side conversations by the coffee cart, and which ones you want to be it's actually easier and faster and better to us to communicate around the country using online systems. So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of years.
And I suppose just reflecting on some of the gifts of this year, the incredible support we've received as an organisation and from all quarters, government, from the broader network, checking in regularly on how we're doing, particularly as we work through that lockdown here in Melbourne with most of the team in Melbourne, but importantly our members. We've had incredible support. The retention rate this year has been incredible in the context of an economic slowdown, and a real faith shown in the Energy Efficiency Council and the role we play in supporting our members and advocating on behalf of them. So to any members and all members watching this, if you've gotten this far, you're clearly one of the true believers. So Thank you. We appreciate the support. We haven't left anything on the field this year, and rest assured that we are going to have a little rest over the next 4 or 5 weeks, but we'll be come back fresh, raring and ready to go to prosecute all of the issues that we care about in 2021, and there's plenty to do. So Rob, Murray-Leach, Holly Taylor, thank you. It's a pleasure to serve with you, as well as the rest of the team, Katie Daly, Katie Bartrup, Kate Jennings and Julianne Tyson. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of Kates in there. We'll get one of them on this call this time next year. But until next year, it's goodbye from us, and we'll see you soon.